What a joy to be a girl dad. My daughter has been a daddy's girl since she realized she was a separate person from her mom. She would tell you that mommy is good at nurturing her boo-boos and setting boundaries. And she would say that daddy is good at fun, excitement, play, and hard philosophical questions. So understanding just our different roles, I think, is really important so that you don't try to have to be good at everything or worry when you're not good at something. And also frees up my wife to play her role and let her shine in her role and her not have to do everything. For girls specifically, I think a lot about how, as a man, can I raise a powerful woman? And I determined that there are four main aspects of this to make sure that my girl turns out as strong and powerful as I believe she's meant to be. You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father. I determined that there are four main aspects of this to make sure that my girl turns out as strong and powerful as I believe she's meant to be. They are: number one, be a powerful man. Number two, model the man that she should expect to have in her life. Three, challenge traditional standards of femininity. And four, teach really good boundaries and body autonomy. So I'm going to break these down. First of all, be a powerful man. Being a girl dad is really not about being girly, right? Girls want strong, powerful men to play with and protect them. Now, Della likes to test this. Her and her friends are always like climbing on me, wanting me to pick them up. Sometimes they'll like hit me with their hands or with objects or kick me or try to hurt me. I don't think they're actually trying to hurt me. They're just trying to see how strong I am. They're just testing my strength. So I try not to get mad at them. I'll tell them, I'll set boundaries ahead. I don't like that. Please don't hit me. But like, I understand that they're not, that this is them trying to see if I'm strong and can protect them. But I also let her paint my toenails. You know, we have tea parties. I let her put bows in my hair. One year she insisted I be Elsa for Halloween. We'll throw a picture there of me as Elsa because my daughter wanted me to be Elsa. I'm going to be Elsa. And that doesn't make me girly. It says that I am secure enough in my masculinity that doing those things doesn't threaten me. I know I'm a manly man and I can still paint my toenails. So it also, I think, shows her that men and women can present their masculinity, femininity in different ways. There aren't these rigid rules. Men can't wear dresses. Men can't paint their toenails. Girls can't play sports, whatever it is, right? Like girl things, some things are girl things. Some things are guy things. Kind of breaks that down and says that I'm a strong enough man that I can paint my toenails and it's fine. Number two is modeling the kind of man that I would want her to have in her life, right? I want her to set her expectations for men and how a man should treat her and be with her based on how I treat her and her mom and be with her and her mom. I don't necessarily want that, but that is the case. The case is girls tend to marry, or if they're not heterosexual, friend or engage with men that are similar to their dad. And so I take this very seriously, right? I mean, influencing who she chooses to spend her life with may be the single largest impact I'm able to have on her long-term happiness. So just think about that how I show up while I'm raising her can affect her happiness for her whole life based on her life partner she picks. So I want her to pick somebody like me. How cool is it that whoever she chooses, I'm going to get to have in my life too, and I'm going to have somebody as cool as me in my life. So I'm really excited about that, but it is a very big responsibility to be that model. So I think about that. So I treat her like I would expect a man to treat my daughter, right? Respectful, honoring, my full attention, loving care, space and approval for all of her feelings and needs, right? Empowering, believing in her. These are all things that I would expect a man to do and that therefore I must do. And I gotta do all those things for for her mom, because I can do them for her, but if she turns around and sees me treat her mom some way differently, she's gonna see that. So I try to do all those things with my wife, especially in front of her. And even when my wife's not around, I brag about my wife. I brag about her mom. And I particularly choose to brag about qualities that I want her to believe are important for her. Things like intelligence, power, creativity, instead of just beauty, right? Instead of just talking about how beautiful or hot my wife is, which she is. But also all these other things, which is true. Intelligent, powerful, creative. Those are all things she is as well. Which that kind of brings me to number 3, which is just challenging the ideas of what is supposed to be feminine. Now, a lot of this is kind of falling away anyway, but there's still remnants, and you see it in the TV shows and books, and you hear people talk about it. So the most important thing for me is beauty standards. I think Della was like barely 3 when she first said, I don't think I'm beautiful because I don't have long blonde hair. And it blew us away. It broke my heart that she's already getting this like standard of beauty just from the like little bit of TV she watched or Barbies or something that taught her that long blonde hair is beauty, and if she doesn't have it, she's not beautiful. So that broke my heart, and also helped emphasize for me like how important it is to uh, talk about how important other things are besides beauty. But beauty's also been very important to her. Like, she's always been really into dresses and jewelry and hair and like makeup, and like beauty's just one of her values. So I do tell her that she's beautiful, but I also make sure to tell her that she's strong, that she's kind, that she's brave, that she's generous, that she's creative, right? Or even the word powerful. I use the word powerful a lot with her. That she's powerful, and make sure to say all those other things a lot more than beauty. And I do the same thing when we're playing pretend. I'm often the male character in whatever game we're playing. Usually Luke Skywalker. That's her favorite. It was my Luke Skywalker as a kid, actually, we play with. I think that's why she likes it. Luke gets into all these different interactions, and he's, of course, always falling in love with the female characters in the game. Her idea. She's been really into love and romance, all that too. It's one of her things. And so I always am careful to say, I notice myself being inclined to be like, she'll be like, oh, he sees her and he really likes her. He falls in love with her. And so my first inclination would be like, oh, look at her. She's so beautiful. I'm in love with her. So I had to really stop myself and be like, nope. I look at her and I say, she seems really confident. She seems really powerful. She seems really kind. And find these ways for Luke to be in love with this female character, for these characteristics that are way beyond beauty. But I had to make myself do that. It was built, beat into me that women like men because they're beautiful. So I had to really challenge that. And number 4 is about boundaries and body autonomy. My experience is that most women and girls were not taught how to really own their bodies, set boundaries, and expect men to hear their boundaries, respect their boundaries, right? I just think that this is something that our society has messed up on in teaching women and girls that somehow men or boys could be entitled to their bodies. So it's very important to me to teach her this. So we made it our mission to teach her this from very early on, and to teach her to set her own boundaries. And also I overtly acknowledge and respect my wife's boundaries, and I model my own boundaries, setting my own boundaries as well. So for her, from day 1, we asked permission to touch her. Even when she was a little baby and couldn't talk, we would not just grab her. We would say, can I pick you up now? I'm going to pick you up now. Is that okay? And watch for her cues. Usually it was either a no cue or like a welcome cue, but occasionally you could get a sense, especially like when they get to like 1 year, 18 months old, they can't quite talk, but they could tell you no, and so very honorable. Okay, I'm not going to pick you up if you don't want to be picked up. And just this phrase, it's your body, you get to decide. And my daughter will sometimes say that to me to this day. She'll say, it's my body, Daddy. I get to decide. And, nothing makes me prouder than her saying that and owning her body. But again, it's not just about what we say, it's about what we do. So I have to enforce my own boundaries so she sees this modeled, which means I don't always play with her when she wants to play with me or the way she wants to play, or I don't always play for as long as she wants, or I tell her to stop when I'm done, or when she's crosses a line in a game that I don't like. We have the safe word seriously, which means no, seriously, I don't like that. And she uses this too, because a lot of our games, when we're roughhousing and stuff, there's a lot of playful resistance, like, no, don't chase me. No, don't eat me, monster, things like that. So the no gets a little messy. So we added seriously as a like, oh no, seriously, I don't want you to chase me, or no, seriously, let me go now. I'm ready to be let go. And I use that too. So she knows that I'm saying, no, I mean it. And she very respectful of the seriously. And I also have my own life, right? I go out with friends. I do self-care. Even when she wants my attention and is sad about me leaving, I still hold that boundary and say, I need to go do these things for myself. That's the way I keep myself full so that I can have my full attention on her when I'm with her. But it also very much models this boundaries that I want her to be able to set in her life as a powerful woman. I want her to be able to tell her or people in her life when she's done, when she needs a break. So those 4 steps to being a great girl dad, right? Power, being a powerful man, being the power for her, modeling the kind of men that we would want her to have in her life, challenging those standards of femininity and complimenting things beyond beauty, and teaching and modeling boundaries and body autonomy, while, of course, loving every moment of my super, super precious little girl. So be a powerful man, raise powerful women, girl dads unite. Drop in the comments one thing that you want your girl to learn about being a woman. Share this with a girl dad in your life. And please like and subscribe wherever you can. It really helps me reach more dads. And stay dedicated.